Olá, o Roda Viva faz hoje o quarto programa da série especial gravada na Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty, no litoral do Rio de Janeiro. Entre os escritores internacionais que vieram à Flip 2007, nós escolhemos um grupo que tem destaque para autores cuja literatura reflete sobre dramas que marcaram a aventura humana nessas últimas décadas. Lutas por independência e democracia, aumento da violência urbana, guerras e conflitos étnicos que desafiam esse mundo globalizado. Nossa entrevistada de hoje é a escritora e ativista política Nadine Gordimer, da África do Sul. Prêmio Nobel de Literatura de 1991, ela ajudou a denunciar ao mundo a realidade de um país que viveu o mais longo e violento regime racista no mundo. O Roda Viva começa em instantes. A literatura de Nadine Gordimer é toda permeada por questões sociais e políticas e pode ser dividida em duas etapas. Na primeira, denuncia o sistema racista sul-africano ao longo de mais de 40 anos. Na segunda, depois da queda do apartheid no final dos anos 80, Nadine passa a retratar as injustiças e dramas que as mudanças provocaram. Nadine Gordimer escreveu seu primeiro conto aos 9 anos de idade. O primeiro romance veio aos 20. E desde então já publicou cerca de 30 livros, entre romances e contos, além de dezenas de ensaios sobre as relações entre literatura e política. Em 1991, quando recebeu o Prêmio Nobel de Literatura, seu nome já havia percorrido o mundo, não só como escritora, mas como voz forte na denúncia contra o apartheid. A África do Sul, colonizada por holandeses e depois ingleses, adotou um regime oficial de segregação racial no final dos anos 40, que submeteu à total humilhação a maioria negra da população do país. Casamentos interraciais foram proibidos, os negros não podiam votar e muito menos usar serviços ou frequentar lugares públicos destinados exclusivamente aos brancos. Uma situação que se tornou explosiva, gerou mobilizações e fez surgir líderes como Nelson Mandela. Símbolo da reação que derrubou o apartheid e primeiro presidente eleito pelo voto direto no país, no início dos anos 90, Mandela teve sua trajetória e ação política narrada em vários livros. Um deles, Uma Lição de Vida, tem prefácio escrito por Nadine Gordimer. Filha de imigrantes judeus e mãe inglesa, Nadine nasceu em Springs, na África do Sul, em 1923. Afastada da elite branca a que pertenceu, teve vários de seus livros censurados pelo regime racista que ela denunciou até o fim do apartheid. E depois disso, passou a refletir sobre as consequências das mudanças na África do Sul, tomada por conflitos econômicos e étnicos. Em 2001, uma semana antes do atentado às Torres Gêmeas de Nova York, a escritora lançou O Engate, seu primeiro romance a abordar uma questão global: os imigrantes ilegais que chegaram não só à África do Sul, mas também à Europa e à América, e que colocaram ao mundo os dilemas da migração e do choque de culturas. Seu último livro editado no Brasil chegou à Flip 2007, Contando Histórias. Nadine organizou nesta edição 21 contos escolhidos pelos próprios autores, 21 dos mais renomados escritores que abriram mão de seus direitos autorais em favor de campanhas de prevenção e combate à AIDS no mundo, em especial na África. Para entrevistar a escritora sul-africana Nadine Gordimer, nós convidamos Eduardo Simões, repórter do Caderno Ilustrada do jornal Folha de São Paulo, Marcelo Cirângelo, diretor do programa Vitrine da TV Cultura, Valéria Lamego, editora e jornalista, Cecília Gianetti, escritora e editora do portal Literal, Ana Maria Gonçalves, escritora, e Miguel Conde, repórter do caderno Prosa e Verso do jornal O Globo. Também temos a participação do cartunista Paulo Caruso, registrando em seus desenhos os momentos e os flagrantes do programa. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional de televisão, pela rede pública, para todo o Brasil. Como o programa está sendo gravado, ele não permite a participação do telespectador, mas as suas perguntas, suas críticas, suas sugestões podem ser encaminhadas pelo e-mail www.tvcultura.com.br/rodaviva. E também podem ser enviadas para o blog da Cultura dentro do site da TV Cultura. Olá, queria começar perguntando para a senhora o seguinte: a sensação que dá para quem olha de fora é que por mais que os escritores lutem contra injustiças, desigualdades, regimes políticos injustos, preconceito, mais essas condições aparecem no mundo. É uma batalha inglória essa, como a de Dom Quixote contra os moinhos de vento, ou há alguma conquista a se, digamos, festejar na luta dos escritores em relação a essas questões?
I think that you have a very pessimistic view, because some things have been achieved and have been achieved through the courage of many people, and the writer's role is a small one by comparison. But after the battle is over, after the dead are lying there, it is the writers, if they are writers at all, who really tell the story of how people got to that point of conflict, and then afterwards how they deal with some sort of conciliation between the two sides, so where humanity overcomes the differences.
Nadine, militância e engajamento podem ter um papel mais importante numa obra de ficção do que a universalidade da história?
Yes, I would agree. It's longer lasting too, because if we are to deal with the future, we have to remember the past. And the way it's recounted in history books, or the way that it appears in print, in journalism, is at a certain level. But it is the ability that writers have, if they're good writers, if they're honest writers, to indeed identify with what went on inside people during the pressures of these the conflicts, how the conflict outside is reflected on the normal human conflicts that we all have in our love life, in our family relations, in our working relations. But if you live in a country where there is conflict, you have this constant pressure from outside as well as solving the problems within. And this is what literature tries to do, to tell the whole story, not just the events.
Nadine, Vargas Llosa acredita que o escritor é um sujeito político. A senhora pensou alguma vez em algum momento em trilhar o caminho da política?
No, when we got our independent country, when we got our freedom, and we had our first election for everybody ever in our long history, because the history of racism in South Africa no doubt runs quite alongside yours in Brazil. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company sent one of their commanders to open a station at Cape Town. That was the beginning of what was then known as apartheid, because here was where the white settlers came and there were the blacks, the people of the country, completely kept on. But when our freedom came, as I say, to my great surprise, I was approached to stand as a member of Parliament. But this is out of the question for me. It's not my role in life. And so I thanked them for the honour and said, no, I don't believe that writers are politicians. And I think it has been proven in several countries when writers take on this job, we are not really up to it. You know, it is not our, in a way I would say, and perhaps this is taking too much credit, we are too questioning. We do not take the right part. It's not for us to be politically correct. On the contrary, we must question all the time the political regimes that we're in.
Existem muitas mudanças ainda a serem feitas na África do Sul?
Yes, there are many, but people must realize how many we've achieved. As I say, it started in 1652, and it was only made official apartheid at the end of 1940. But we have, for instance, to give you an example, there are many, many thousands of people in the rural areas who for the first time have running water, and others are also in what were formerly the so-called informal settlements, which are really shack slums, such as you see in all over South America and in Africa. There, for the first time, many, many people have electric light. To press a button, we're so used to it, and the light comes on. How important this is, for instance, for young people and students. When they come home, when they will have to do their homework, they can turn on a light. But we have still got, in terms of housing, upgrading housing, a great deal to do. Also because in recent years, we have this tremendous influx of refugees from everywhere, from Congo, from Zimbabwe, from Cote d'Ivoire, you name it. And they all have to be housed and fed and taken care of. So I always say to people in the Western world, you have had several hundred years to establish a democracy. Don't expect us to have done it since 1994. Give us time. But that doesn't mean to say we must be complacent. We know there are very many things we have to do.
Nadine, os seus livros, como foi dito aqui, têm uma grande importância política, mas eles não se esgotam nisso, eles têm um grande valor literário também. Eles não são apenas panfletos. Como trazer a política para a literatura sem cair numa obra panfletária? Como é que se evita isso? O que distingue uma obra meramente panfletária de uma boa obra de ficção?
I have never written political books. I have written books taking from the world around me that I know and that I was born into, how people live, how they live within the framework, whether it's a democracy, whether it's a kingdom, whether it is a fascist regime, whether it's any kind of oppressive regime. This shapes you and your life. So what I have written about, what I have peopled my books with, was the examples. They're examples of the kind of pressures which form them and their lives. And from this comes naturally the political situation. I have never written about the political situation as such. I've never written propaganda. There are propagandists, leave it to them. I've always kept, indeed, against many pressures, the integrity to whatever gifts I have as a writer. That's what I have, and the quality of the writing must come first. And the quality of the writing then, indeed, is at the service of whatever the theme is. If it contains a lot of political content, yes. If it's a personal conflict between people, then it has to be adapted to use to express that.
Nadine, o livro O Engate, que foi recentemente lançado no Brasil, da senhora, tem uma personagem feminina, a protagonista, que é uma personagem claramente de exceção. Quer dizer, é uma mulher branca que recusa a sua origem de classe e que enxerga com, digamos, liberalidade ou com humanidade o outro, que no caso é um imigrante muçulmano. A senhora concorda que esse é um personagem de exceção, que esta não é a realidade no mundo de hoje, que esse tipo de compreensão ainda não está disseminada?
It's not all that rare in my country. And I would be surprised to think that it was all that rare here, because you've had such a mixture of people for so very long. But you see, the character in the book that you're referring to, she's someone who feels she has failed to take part in giving herself to the liberation. It was possible for white people, indeed, to take part in the liberation, which was led by blacks, but there were also whites who had leading roles and who indeed went to prison, along with Nelson Mandela and others. But she didn't do that. She comes from a very conventional white family, hardly even liberal. And she has come to the stage where she is sick of the dishonesty of all this, and feels that in the new South Africa to live like that is indeed not a real life. What is a little unusual about that is it's not an African that she falls in love with, that it is another stranger, also someone who is not white, who's on the other side. And of course also the question of the religion and the religious customs. You may remember that when she says she's going to go with her Arab lover, and she wants to spend the rest of her life with him, to his country, presumably Saudi Arabia, I never say what it is, and her father says to her, "You are a feminist. How can you go into a country where you will be expected to wear the veil?" So all these incredible conflicts come up after you think peace has come to your country and you have solved the direct conflict between black and white in her country, which is mine, South Africa.
Eu queria saber, me parece que a senhora saiu um pouco do seu tema natural, que era falar sobre as questões sul-africanas, nesse livro, exatamente, que você fala também sobre imigração. Imigração me parece hoje um dos grandes problemas das sociedades modernas, né? A gente cada vez ouve falar mais. A senhora acha que a imigração é um dos grandes problemas hoje em dia? As pessoas têm dificuldade de lidar com isso? Por isso, talvez, você tenha abordado esse tema no livro?
Well, first of all, it's not new at all. Indeed, I am the child of immigration. My mother came from England and my father from Latvia. So they had to deal in their way with whatever their social and economic level was with the country. And so it has gone on. If you look around the world, when you think how America, all the thousands of Irish people who have risen as high as the presidency, came originally because of the potato famine in Ireland. So immigration is nothing new. Alas, one of my themes at the back of my mind in that book is that how terrible that it goes on forever, that you can never be at home where you are born. You've always got to look for a home somewhere else and be treated a stranger. Somehow make people accept you. So that is really the theme behind the personal story of that book. But of course it's also strange that the girl feels more at home in his background. But that again has, as I've said, political reasons.
Nadine, falando de background, o fato de sua família ter o background judaico, ter origens judaicas, afetou a sua obra e como? Sua visão de mundo e consequência da sua obra?
Not at all, except in my view, for myself personally, to be a Jew is like being black. You are born like that. There's a certain fate in it, and that you shouldn't ever want to deny. On the other hand, it's nothing to be proud of. The only reason for being proud is to live like a human being and accept other human beings. That's the only reason for pride in your life. For myself, I didn't have a Jewish background at all. I wasn't brought up going to any to the synagogue or celebrating any of the ceremonies and things that make you Jewish. But this just doesn't mean that I'm not a Jew. But I am, first of all, a South African. I'm not a European either. I'm a white African. So I think that you have to look at the reality of your background. I suppose if you choose, you can become then, if you have the instinct of belief. I don't have it. I'm an atheist. I'm afraid I'm just depending upon my fellow human beings, how they treat me and how I treat them.
Nadine, vamos fazer um rápido intervalo e a gente volta num instante com Roda Viva especial nesta Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A gente volta já já. Voltamos com Roda Viva e a edição especial na Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty 2007. A nossa entrevistada de hoje é a escritora e ativista política Nadine Gordimer, da África do Sul. Nadine, no seu livro De Volta à Vida, a questão que se aborda é a questão do meio ambiente. É uma área em que há, sim, militância política, ativismo político muito forte e há também forças muito poderosas contestando essa militância. Como é que a senhora se coloca em relação a essa militância, a essa questão do meio ambiente?
the militants who are against the environmental horrors that are going on around us, the threat indeed to the very air that we breathe. Well, I feel very deeply and strongly about it. There are two issues indeed, that one and the question of HIV and AIDS that concern me greatly, you know, as a human being in our world. And both these things, and particularly the environment, because I'm sure that there will be some cure found for AIDS sooner or later, but this question of polluting the very air we breathe and killing the plants that we live on, this is something for the whole future of humanity. You know, are we dinosaurs? Are we going to die out? And some other form of life take over? So it is perhaps the biggest question that human beings have ever been faced with. Well, what can you do? You watch what is going on. When there are protests, you can sign against them. In my own country, and I hear now that not far from where we're sitting now, there is a nuclear power reactor. We have a big one very near large populations on the fringe of Cape Town. And there are now 3 more planned, because we're all eating up energy, and the natural fuels, they're not enough. And then there's the question that they pollute. We have abundant coal in South Africa, so we could turn it almost entirely to coal. But what happens then? So now we are turning to, by we, I mean this is a government decision, that we are turning to building more nuclear pebble reactors. And I'm against that, and when I have the opportunity, I speak out against it, of course. But I don't write about such subjects. In this latest book of mine, there is the paradox. The young man is an ecologist, and then he gets a form of cancer whose radiation treatment, makes he himself an object that lets off these dangerous rays. So, and that's how the theme, which is a political one, comes into the imagination of the novelist and comes into a single human question.
Nadine, muitos críticos apostaram que a sua literatura perderia a vitalidade com a nova África do Sul. E isso a senhora demonstrou que não aconteceu. Como a senhora lidou com essa crítica? E em algum momento a senhora passou pela cabeça que isso poderia acontecer? Que a sua literatura perderia o sentido?
Well, it just makes me laugh at the ignorance of anybody who could say this. Because if you are a real writer, you can make the death of a pet cat something extraordinary. You can make, as Kafka did with Gregor the beetle, this becomes symbolic of many things in life. There is no such thing as the end of a subject unless life ends. The changes in my country and in any other country where there has been a tremendous civil war and it is over, people have to live in a new way. They're beginning to live together in a new way. They're beginning to look at each other and understand one another in a new way. And this is surely an absolutely wonderful subject. This is something that we didn't write about before because it couldn't happen before. So in other words, so far as I'm concerned, there's much more now to write about. Young writers coming into their ability now are much freer. That doesn't mean to say you throw the past away, but the fact is that either life interests you or it doesn't. And to be a writer, life must endlessly interest you. You're always going into the very mystery of the fact that we're alive.
Nadine.
Logo após o anúncio do Nobel, houve uma declaração da senhora dizendo que eu tenho 2 papéis na minha vida, um como escritora e outro, meu comprometimento com a causa da liberdade na África do Sul e a criação de uma cultura pós-apartheid na África do Sul. Esses 2 papéis ainda existem, ou seja, é possível mesmo haver essa divisão ou a literatura é uma forma de atuar, ou seja, a literatura precisa ser engajada ou não necessariamente. É possível que se haja um papel de escritora e de lutando para essa nova formação da cultura pós-apartheid.
Well, to first for the cultural post-apartheid, that is for government officials. We writers don't fight for a culture. It's for us to do our work. Goethe, the very great German writer, I hardly need to add, said somewhere, wherever you live, whatever your circumstances, you close your eyes, you put your hand deep into the society around you, and what you bring up in that hand is a little bit of the truth of the life that is being lived. And I think that's all that a writer does, certainly a fiction writer or a poet, that you are grappling around within the social forces, within the changes in personal relations, with this different attitudes towards sex, towards material things. All this forms the human personality, and this is what forms your characters. They will reflect what the historian says are political changes, but their political changes are within the very integument of each human being living at that time. And this is our material, that little scraping that Goethe says we brought up. No writer can grasp the whole of it. It's our little bit of the truth as we find it about human beings.
Agora, esse mergulho pode ser dentro da pessoa, digamos, afastadas das circunstâncias. Há escritores que afirmam que, digamos, são os demônios internos, são aquelas forças e as loucuras que cada cidadão tem que podem, digamos, movimentar a literatura. Eu sei que essa não é, digamos, a via que a senhora trafega, mas a senhora acredita e aprecia essa literatura que mergulha profundamente nos dramas individuais, sem que eles reflitam a realidade em torno?
Well, of course I do, but I disagree that they don't reflect reality. Of course they do. And indeed, we all know that there's a very close connection between the genius of the imagination and madness. Yes, you go beyond the literal things. So all this can happen, and as we've seen in the characters, everybody from Dostoevsky down, here it is. It is the ability of the writer to grasp this turmoil that's inside and the turmoil outside. But they are very closely connected.
Nadine, o seu próximo livro, Beethoven Was 16th Black, a senhora ouviu numa conversa, essa frase numa conversa de DJs, numa rádio. Conta pra gente um pouco mais sobre esse episódio que eu achei muito curioso.
Yes. Well, as so often happens, you know, the ravens feed you, as we say. Yes, because I love to listen to the classical music program on the radio. And you know how these disc jockeys, or whatever they're called, are? They always like to read something from the package. And this was a Beethoven Concerto, and he announced the number and so on, and then he obviously read out, Beethoven was 1/16th black. And I laughed. I thought, how funny, you know, what has this got to do with what we're going to listen to? But then it connected up with a phenomenon that is becoming evident in South Africa. All during the apartheid time, there are many people who had black blood, a grandmother or a great-grandfather, completely concealed, especially among the Afrikaner people who were, who created apartheid. Not that those who were not Afrikaners were unwilling. They also wanted to sit on top of the black man. But it somehow caught my imagination and thought, well, now people are proudly saying, well, you know, my name is so-and-so, but way back I did have this great-grandmother who was half Xhosa or Zulu or whatever, even though it's not evident in the face at all. And that is really how the story came about, that one could think now, maybe it would be nice. I'm a white South African, And perhaps I can claim a little drop, a 1/16th. So that's how the story came about.
Nadine, tive a impressão, pela sua resposta ao Marcum, que você acha que, na verdade, toda boa literatura, ao mergulhar no indivíduo, revela algo da sociedade em que esse indivíduo está. Então, você diria que a literatura, a boa literatura, sempre tem sentido político também?
Yes, I do. I think even if it's unintentional of the writer, because the writer lives in a certain world, in a certain society, and it's there in the subconscious. So I do believe, I really can't think of anything. Even fairy stories are saying something about power, aren't they? The ones that are read to us when we're little, and about the good and the bad. This is all political, in the broadest sense. So thank you for that question. I think it's a good one.
Então, eu ouvi falar, não sei se é verdade, que a senhora acha a short story, o conto, uma forma interessante de literatura hoje em dia. Isso é verdade?
I certainly think that the short story, much more than an interesting form of literature, is a great form of literature. You've only got to think of Gogol, Chekhov, Maupassant. We could go on, and right up to the present day. A good example is, you may not know, I wanted to know what writers could do, indeed, to raise money for people who are HIV positive or suffering from AIDS, to provide propaganda against getting HIV positive, and generally to take up this cause. Because the musicians have taken it up in a big way, and I felt writers had done nothing. So I decided, let me do something in a small way myself. So I wrote to 20 writers, some of whom are my friends, and others who are whose work I like as story writers. There are novelists who write only novels, and there are novelists who write wonderful short stories as well. So obviously these were people who wrote short stories. I got wonderful short stories from 20 of them, ranging from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a wonderful short story, to Woody Allen, to, you name it, Günter Grass, Jose Saramago, all over the world. And they gave me not a story, they didn't write a story about the subject of HIV and AIDS. These were stories that they thought were some of the best they've written. So it's a wide variety of subjects. And really, that collection of 20, when you go from one to the other and see how different minds and different sensibilities have grasped, sharing the same world, living at the same period, all roughly contemporary, it's a remarkable achievement in itself. It's got nothing to do really with whether you can write a good novel or not. So I think that everybody who writes both, as I do, has their own concept of what it is. To me, if I have something I want to write and it's going to be a short story, it's like an egg. There it is, there's the white part, there's the yolk, there's the shell holding it. Whereas a novel is staked out in stages, so that I may think it out so far, and then it may change for the next stage. It doesn't come like that egg. But if you talk to other writers there, we'll probably get other views. It's a wonderful, beautiful form, just as poetry is. It's not, as some people think, a sort of little boiled-down novel. It isn't. It's a different form altogether, and a big discipline to write it.
É mais fácil ou mais difícil escrever um conto do que um romance? Se é que é possível fazer essa pergunta.
Well, as I write both, I can't tell you. I don't find it... they each have their own demands. The only thing is, of course, the short story is something that is complete sooner. You live with a novel for a couple of years, usually. Whereas a short story you may write in a few days and revise in a week.
Bem, eu queria que a gente fizesse um rápido intervalo. Nós fazemos um rápido intervalo neste Roda Viva especial da Festa Literária de Paraty, com a escritora Nadine Gordimer, da África do Sul, e a gente volta já já. Você acompanha hoje no Roda Viva a entrevista de Nadine Gordimer, escritora e ativista política da África do Sul, Prêmio Nobel de Literatura de 1991 e uma das convidadas desta série especial que organizamos na Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty, edição 2007. A senhora trabalhou em alguns documentários e em filmes para a televisão. Eu queria saber qual é a diferença de se trabalhar a novela, o romance e um script para a televisão, além daquelas óbvias de que, evidentemente, tem que se pensar na imagem. É o mesmo ofício? A senhora imagina que é a mesma oportunidade de contar uma história?
I don't work for TV. I don't write TV.
Bom, tem aqui numa pesquisa...
There were 3 films made from short stories of mine. And this is long ago. And I wrote the adaptation of one of the stories, but that's the only thing I've ever done. I don't write for television.
Nem pretende? E nem pretende trabalhar?
But what for? The written word on paper in a book is what I believe in and what I know that I can do. I have no desire to look for another medium.
Você já falou que a imagem está substituindo a palavra como forma principal de entretenimento da nossa sociedade. Isso é algo que te preocupa, é algo que você tema?
It is a concern for me, indeed, to think that fewer books are being sold. People are looking at the image. They want the image rather than the word. And, of course, always my classic example, which happens to be so true. The bedtime story that I had and my children had and probably you had read to you, and there were characters you loved in that story, and then you begin to look at the words and you learn to read. The children now, including my own grandchildren, get put in front of the TV before bedtime. That's the bedtime story. And it's a charming little cartoon or something, but it is not the book. And so the love of the book that you have with you all your life and that you can take with you anywhere, you take that book, you can sit you can stand in a long queue, you can sit on a mountain top, you can lie in a rubber boat on the sea and read. You don't need anything but that book. You don't need a battery, which can run out, and then you can't listen anymore to a recorded story. If you're at home and you've got electricity, if the power fails, the image is gone and all goes with it. That never happens with a book. Mm-hmm. And with a book, you can always turn back. You don't have to plug in, change anything. You want to look back to page 30 when you're on page 60, you simply turn back.
Você acha que a palavra transmite coisas que as imagens não transmitem? Você diria que a literatura é mais profunda, por exemplo, que o cinema, ou esse tipo de comparação não faz muito sentido para você?
No, I think it's a very apt comparison because, first of all, the movie, it moves you and you think about it and it's gone. With the light, it's gone. Whereas, as I've said, with the book, if you're thinking about it later, you can simply turn back the page, so that many of the forms that use the image are good to convey instant information, yes, but they do not give illumination. They don't make you think in the long term the way that reading does.
Por favor, aqui, Cecília.
A senhora organizou o Telling Tales, conseguiu ajudar numa campanha pelo combate e a prevenção da AIDS, e gostaria de saber a sua opinião, que a senhora receitaria para os escritores de um país que não lê, o que eles poderiam fazer para combater esse tipo de mal. No caso do Brasil é bastante grave. O que os escritores do Brasil poderiam fazer para combater a falta de leitores?
Well, I don't think that you could use your literary gifts, indeed, to directly to promote people thinking about AIDS. That indeed belongs to the media, not to us. My little effort was a tiny effort of the kind that we could make. But you should remember, not one of those stories is about somebody with AIDS. They are just stories of all kinds of things in life. So one can't say that the content of the book is not a weapon against AIDS. It was simply a financial thing that the profits from the book would go indeed to help people, and some people who write very good propaganda, billboards, texts, and so on, to wake up people to the problems of HIV and AIDS. But I don't think writers can do this directly, because then you become a propagandist. They're necessary, but then we would be neglecting our own work, which is different.
Algum dos autores convidados para o Telling Tales chegou a recusar a participação, não pôde participar por algum motivo?
No, not one. And I had the feeling they were waiting for something that they could do, the way the musicians do with their concerts. And this was a little opportunity, which has indeed grown amazingly. And I have to thank them all very much, who gave their stories, no payment, and all the rights for it to be in different languages. It has 16 editions all over the world, growing all the time, more editions, and it's bringing in a fair sum of money, which is what we all wanted, who contributed to it. And I must also thank the publishers, including the publisher here in Brazil, for simply taking production costs, but no profit at all.
Nesse livro, o conto que a senhora publica é a história de uma família de refugiados internos, que se mudam de um lugar para o outro em função das agruras da África, que é outro drama frequente da atualidade. Que medida a senhora acha que esse tipo de abordagem pode também, nesse caso, contribuir alguma coisa para melhorar a situação, até pelo fato de que, muito provavelmente, os envolvidos nesse processo, aquelas crianças e aquelas famílias, sequer vão ter acesso a esse tipo de literatura?
Well, it's interesting because we come now to the question whether those of us who lived in South Africa and wrote during the apartheid time and wrote what is called anti-apartheid literature for the simple reason that, speaking for myself and others, we were writing, we were not saying this is apartheid. We were showing what happened in people's lives. And in my own case, as I've said, 3 of my books were banned, so it couldn't have any influence on the people there. But I was writing in a world language, in English, and the books were published outside and then translated. And I think that we did, in our small way, wake up people to the real human consequences. You know, you can say what the principles of Nazism were. You can say what the principles of fascism were in Italy. You can say what the principles of apartheid were. But to show how it affected people's individual lives, you have to know the people, and you have to show indeed what happened. Now, in the case of the story you're referring to, The Ultimate Safari, as a matter of fact, I'm going to read a piece from it when Amos Oz and I appear in a couple of days' time. But this was, the facts are absolutely true. People walked through the Kruger Park, through the lions and the elephants, and came to an electrified fence, so that if you tried to climb over it, it killed you. You got electrocuted. But such is human ingenuity that people learned how to dig. In remote parts, it was patrolled, but there were parts where they knew they're not there today. They'll come only tomorrow, because we have a huge border along there between South Africa, the Kruger Park, and Mozambique, and they dug a shallow trench underneath and wriggled through. And there they were in these refugee camps on the other side. And that's where the story is set, of course.
A África é um continente ignorado pela mídia, inclusive no Brasil, onde grande parte da população descende de africanos. A senhora tem esperança de que isso mude algum dia?
Indeed. I don't agree that certainly my own country isn't ignored in the rest of the world.
Não, a África do Sul talvez seja uma exceção, né? Mas em função da luta contra o apartheid. Mas se a gente examinar, por exemplo, as colônias, antigas colônias portuguesas, e o que o brasileiro conhece disso, por exemplo, é nada. Muito pouco.
Well, I'm afraid then that's the fault of your newspapers and your journalists here, because we know about these things, and I found people in England and in America too. I think it's must be a decision to turn away from this, because you're very much connected. You had this enormous slave population that was shipped over here, and never mind Beethoven and the 1/16th, you've got a lot of their blood flowing in the veins of Brazilians. I'm very surprised to hear that.
Pois é. Eduardo?
Nadine, a senhora recebeu diversos prêmios literários, dois deles os mais prestigiosos, o Nobel e o Booker Prize. Eles serviram mais para dar uma legitimação à sua obra literária ou a visibilidade à sua mensagem política? Ou ambos?
No, I don't think so. I think the only prize that has a real influence in readership. I was fortunate in that I was already a well-known writer with many translations all over the world by the time I got the Nobel Prize in 91. Because the Nobel Prize I've seen, indeed, with other writers, has made an important difference. Let us take, indeed, the Portuguese language. I, who consider myself well-read, I read, if I'm not writing, I'm reading. It's so much in my life. I had never read anything by Saramago because he was hardly translated into English. And when he got the Nobel Prize, suddenly there were the translations of the books by this genius of a writer. So a big prize can make a difference. But I don't think the others make such a difference. Probably in America, the prizes they have, which are not open to the world, they're not international prizes, but are for Americans, I imagine that they bring a big readership to within their own country.
Mas além do leitorado aumentar, a sensação da legitimação da qualidade literária veio também, e a visibilidade da sua mensagem política. Qual que teve mais peso?
Yes, of course. And if your work indeed, as everybody's has, whether it is visible or not, if it has a political meaning buried in it, then that is a wake-up call to the rest of the world as well.
Gostaria que a senhora falasse para a gente um pouquinho sobre a experiência de ter tido os livros censurados durante o regime do apartheid. Como cidadã e como escritora, como é que isso toca mais?
It's a most disturbing and frustrating experience, because you always want to be read by your own people. As I say, I was lucky enough to be writing in a world language, a very wide world language such as English, and so my books then, they were not dead. They appeared elsewhere. But this is a sad experience, and you feel somehow that there's a hand over your mouth among your own people. You're not speaking to them. You want their reactions, because it is from their lives, the texture of their lives, that the book has come, and then there's no response because they can't read it. They were unbanned at various times. The one of them was 12 years banned. So by the time it was unbanned, then people in my own country were reading it. The two others, it was a shorter time because we got our freedom.
A sua formação literária inicial veio mais no contato com a literatura inglesa mesmo, ou de outros países. Que autor te influenciou na sua formação como escritora ainda na sua juventude?
Well, we must go back to when I was a child, because it was very strange living in the southern hemisphere and having Christmas in the sunshine and in the swimming pool, as you know only too well. The books were about children making snowmen and skating, and so that in a way you felt that you belonged to another world. It was as if you were on another planet, and that the real world was the one indeed where it was winter, and that you didn't quite know what corner of the planet you were stuck into. But that, of course, was an early childhood thing. But the reading from that time on was, of course, in English, and then was mainly from England and also from America, and perhaps from the other, what they were colonies at the time, Australia and Canada.
Teve algum autor que foi decisivo nos seus primeiros anos? Enfim,
Well, then what I have missed out is, of course, the works that were in translation, so that I very early on, then in my teens, read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, big influence on my beginning to write short stories. I think he was the greatest short story writer that ever lived. In England, D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, and all these became one's influences, really. And then when I read first in translation, when I was about 18, Marcel Proust, that became a lifelong influence in my writing. And later on, fortunately, much later, in middle age, then I was able to read Marcel Proust in French.
As reportagens publicadas sobre a senhora, que estão na nossa pesquisa, afirmam que a senhora economiza as palavras, que a senhora não permite palavras, digamos, a mais no texto. E a gente teve aqui no Brasil um escritor muito importante, chamado Graciliano Ramos, que era um obsessivo revisor, trabalhava como revisor, e é um grande nome da literatura brasileira, e que também utilizava o lápis para eliminar palavras ao longo do texto. Eu queria saber se isso é fato na sua obra e por que a senhora faz assim.
What? Of his text? Of his text?
Sim. Se a senhora, ao fazer um texto, se a senhora depois revisa e vai reduzindo ele como alguém que busca a essência.
Very little. Very little. But I think it goes on in your head in the middle of the night, when you're driving, when you're walking, you are editing, you are cutting out. But I have found, when I look now back at my early work, that it was much more, how shall I put it? It was, some of it I would now cut if I were writing it now. One of the particular things, and I'm looking at your particular kind of palm tree while I'm here, when you are young, everything you see is for the first time. So to describe in detail what that palm tree looks like, it's important. But as time goes by, you lose this fresh eye, and you're concentrating much more on other things. And if I look at my later books, the present ones, there's far less physical description. It's been pared away, and I've learned now to look for the significant detail, that not to describe whether you've got stripes on your shirt and whether you've got grey sideburns or what shape of your mouth, but to choose one of the details that makes the reader see you. But that comes, of course, with a long experience of writing. I think it's a good thing. But I may be wrong. Maybe I have lost that wide use of description and many adjectives and a broader vocabulary. But for me, I have disciplined myself to make things more succinct and more, how shall I put it, evolved into something very concise.
Ok. Vamos fazer mais um rápido intervalo e voltamos a seguir com o último bloco da entrevista de hoje da Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty com Nadine Gordimer, escritora da África do Sul. A gente volta já já. Bem, voltamos com o Roda Viva especial na Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A nossa entrevistada de hoje é a escritora sul-africana Nadine Gordimer, Prêmio Nobel de Literatura de 1991 e que também participou da Flip 2007. Eu queria saber da senhora como é que a senhora encara esse tipo de evento, essa reunião de escritores de várias partes do mundo e esse contato direto com os leitores.
Well, there isn't too much contact with the readers so far, but certainly with the writers. And it's always a pleasure and intriguing to meet writers that you haven't met before, especially if you admire their work. And of course, the great pleasure is meeting writers who are your great friends, and we all live scattered around the world. So to come together here now with Amos Oz and several others, you know, is a great joy.
Nadine, o que você traz na mala quando você vai numa viagem assim? O que você trouxe para ler aqui?
Well, I always feel, you never know, a plane you may get stuck somewhere, you must have at least 2 books in your little overnight bag. I had that prepared, and then the day that I left, something wonderful happened. A publisher in America sent me an advanced reading copy of 17 short stories, never before published in English, by Primo Levi, which was just simply amazing that this genius of a writer, here were stories that I had never read and that nobody, except people who read Italian, had ever read before. They were never translated. So I had these to read on the plane. And if we talk about the worth of the short story, they are absolutely remarkable. And also the fact that we were talking about how you feel about your early work and how your mode may have changed. 2 or 3 of them, apparently, he published in his volumes of short stories. He cut them out. He didn't think that they were good enough. But they are quite wonderful. So it shows you how very strict we writers are about our work. He was wrong in this case. He should have kept them in.
E o que a senhora pretende levar na mala? A senhora conheceu algum autor brasileiro ou algo da literatura brasileira?
Well, I'm hoping still to go to the bookshop and to get some, work of Brazilian writers in translation that I will certainly take in my, not only in my suitcase, but in my little cabin bag.
A senhora encara de que maneira a força da internet, do computador, em relação à literatura? Há quem diga que a internet e essa presença do jovem diante da tela do computador é, na verdade, uma espécie de atentado à língua, à medida em que eles usam uma linguagem que não, digamos, respeita os rigores da gramática. E outros afirmam ao contrário, que isso é uma espécie de porta de entrada para o mundo da escrita e que poderá redundar no futuro numa profusão de escritores.
No, I don't think so. I think it's extremely useful as a means of getting information. I cannot emphasize too strongly the difference between information and inspiration in the sense of making you think, not being fed something. And I also think that one of the problems with internet is this communication with somebody that you don't see, these great friendships and flirtations and, you know, love affairs in the air and friendships in the air. No doubt it's a nice resource for lonely people, but I think it's a sad substitute, especially for the young, to sit in front of that machine and communicate instead of being among living beings.
Como a senhora vê a velocidade da informação hoje em dia? A senhora que viveu num tempo em que as coisas andavam de forma bem mais devagar e até, quer dizer, a gente tem visto mudanças muito grandes com a tecnologia. De que forma a tecnologia pode afetar até na criação, quer dizer, para um escritor? Como é que é isso na visão de um escritor que faz isso há muito tempo? Quer dizer, a velocidade da informação, isso é uma coisa prejudicial, na sua opinião? É uma coisa que pode ser bom para o futuro da humanidade?
Well, you might as well say, since Shakespeare was a great genius, and he had to sit and write with a pen. By the time we got to the old manual typewriter, it was going to destroy literature. By the time the typewriter is taken over by the computer, the method by which it's going to be produced, as long as it produces the written word printed on paper and published in a book, these wonderful new inventions, as I can't help repeating again, are fine for information. You want to know something quickly, right, you go to the internet. But even there, I think there's one unfortunate development, that people don't use dictionaries anymore. Whereas it's rather fun if you like dictionaries. You look up a word and then you suddenly see, my God, there are 5 words that you don't know of at all, and that are not used. So if you're interested at all in the word, it's a pity to lose the dictionary simply for technological reasons.
Nós temos um autor aqui na Flip esse ano chamado Ismael Beá. Ele está lançando uma autobiografia de uma parte da vida dele chamada Long Way Gone, Muito Longe de Casa. E eu queria saber se a senhora conhece esse trabalho e o que pensa desse tipo de livro, de memórias, no sentido de como eles podem ajudar o resto do mundo a tomar conhecimento do que acontece lá.
Well, it's interesting that I'm asked this because I sat beside him at lunch and we got friendly. We were the only 2 from Africa. And he was telling me about the book. And it's his very first book. And he regards it partly as fiction. It's a fictionalized life. So it's on the way to a novel. I'm very eager to read it. And of course, this kind of writing from parts of the world where there are not very many writers, it is indeed important as a kind of introduction, because it isn't a piece of journalism. It is, as he explained it to me, it's part of his own personal perception of the world, which is halfway to the novel. And I'm looking forward to reading it because speaking to him, he sounded like someone who has real talent, who knows that the only way you can learn to write is to read and read and read. You can't take little courses to teach you to write.
Quando um autor, como por exemplo o Ismael Beá, usa sua própria biografia para construir sua ficção, ele não corre o risco de um dia ver essa fonte secar?
No, he's very young. All sorts of things are going to happen to him. The whole drama of his life has only begun. So I have no worry about that. If he's got the instinct to be a writer, there's no such thing as nothing to write about. The only people who have nothing to write about are not writers, and they should be doctors or lawyers or actors or something else.
Esses contos do Primo Levi que você falou foram cortados por ele ou pelo editor? Eu não entendi direito. Foi o editor que cortou?
Foi o editor.
Esses 17 contos inéditos foram cortados de um livro porque ele achou que não eram bons o bastante. Foram cortados pelo próprio Primo Levi ou pelo editor?
No, apparently among his papers, since he died, then they find things that he had discarded or that it says this appeared in such and such a journal.
Ele mesmo não quis publicar.
And then there is a preface before the stories explaining how they were found and how his own publishers decided then that they must be republished together.
Você acha que o escritor é um bom juiz da sua própria obra? Você, ao produzir um texto, você sabe, você tem certeza se está bom ou se está ruim?
Absolutely sure. And sometimes you are praised for the wrong thing in your book. You know that wasn't the best thing in the book. You know your own faults. If you haven't learned to recognize what you have achieved and what you have failed to achieve, then you're not going to be much of a writer. You are your own best critic, I find. So that sometimes people praise one of your books, that's not your best book to your mind. And then another one that is really good doesn't get the same attention.
Pergunta é clássica, eu tenho que fazer, é a curiosidade
Yes.
do público, tenho certeza. Como é que é o processo de trabalho da senhora? Quantas horas a senhora trabalha? É algo regular? É uma história que lhe atormenta e que precisa ser publicada? Ou existe uma disciplina e rigor frequentes e constantes?
No, I never accept a deadline unless it would be, say now, in my old age, very often I get asked to write a preface to some writer's work. For instance, I've been a great admirer for many, many years of Mahfouz, the Egyptian writer. And when asked to write a preface to a new edition of his pharaonic novels, you know, I'm delighted to do it because I'm a lover of the lyric and I like to think that now people will read these books who perhaps hadn't, or they've been out of print in English. So then I have to say, well, by when do you need it? Then I'm meeting a deadline. But for my own work, if I tell my publisher, yes, I am starting a new novel, when can we expect? I don't know. When I've finished it, I will tell you. But I work every day for the whole morning, from about 9 till 1:30. Shut off. Telephone off, door closed, everything. Because you see, other people have secretaries and heaven knows what. You want to see Mr. So-and-so, oh, just a moment. But we writers don't have that kind of protection. So we have to make it for ourselves. So that's my main working time. I might read over at night before I go to bed, or when I come home when I've been out somewhere, what I've written in the morning, and make a few little changes. But I'm not a night worker. I'm a day worker, morning worker.
O senhor escreve à mão,
No, typewriter.
mas não computador.
No, not a computer. No, people don't understand. With a computer, the great thing is you can erase. But when you're writing fiction, you want that alternative phrase just typed in at the top or scribbled in at the top, and you don't want to have to print it out to do it. So, and I find I'm not alone in this. There are a number of other writers. It's wonderful, I think, for your letters, yes, correspondence, and for journalism, but for the kind of writing that we novelists do, no good.
Valéria.
Nadine, a senhora afirmou que nunca escreverá a sua autobiografia porque teria o ciúme da sua própria privacidade. Queria que a senhora falasse um pouquinho sobre isso.
Yes, I think that one must be allowed to have a private life. And also, how can you decide how much affects the others, the people closest to you in your closest relationships? Must you go around to each of them and say, do you mind? Can I write about our meeting 30 years ago and our brief love affair in Brazil? You know? Or can you ask your children, how would you feel about this, that, or the other that happened? I think it's an intrusion on not only your own private life, but on that of others. And my private life is my own. It's quite difficult, of course, to keep it that way, because people are very curious. It seems to me that, for instance, pop stars, they really live off this. If you haven't got an exciting private life, nobody's going to come and hear you sing or play. You know. But for us, it's better that we are left shut up in our... We are our own boss, and we're responsible only for ourselves.
Qual é o papel que o humor tem na literatura da senhora? No texto que a senhora produz?
It's not deliberate, but it's always there because, you know, people do funny things. A very wry sort of humor, unconsciously funny.
No livro The Pickup, o Engate, os diálogos são entremeados boa parte do tempo pelos pensamentos dos personagens. Até que ponto isso não revela o seu interesse pelo que é dissimulado em relações sociais de diversos níveis, o que é dito e o que não é dito? Ou é apenas um expediente, um artifício narrativo, usar os pensamentos dos personagens?
Well, it's a thing, of course, that we writers do. It's the authorial intervention. I don't do it much. I set myself the task of what the character says, also revealing what he or she doesn't say. And I also hope for an intelligent reader who will see, especially as the book goes on, the kind of person this is, and when they are lying or falsifying and when they are not. But, and you'll notice too that I never any more use he said and she said. I think it's a test of a writer that the character, the reader must be able to see this is the way that one speaks and that one does not. I don't have to say he said, she said. So I've long ago thrown that out.
Marcelo.
Queria fazer uma pergunta até a certo ponto delicada, principalmente porque a senhora tem uma grande atividade política durante uma vida, mas é uma coisa que, para nós, até da nossa geração, é uma coisa que nos confundiu um pouco, que é os conceitos sobre ideologia. Quer dizer, então eu gostaria muito de ouvir a sua opinião. O que é ser de esquerda hoje, na sua opinião?
Well, of course, leftist has changed its meaning. It used to mean, in some countries, indeed, that you were a member of a communist party. It meant in others that you belonged to the party of the left. In other countries, it meant even that you were a liberal. So that you had conservative, liberal, left, you know, in that way. I have belonged indeed to the left in my thinking and in my experience of life that has led me to think that this is indeed the only concept that I can follow. But I never joined the South African Communist Party, so I didn't suffer the disillusion, you know, of the fall of the Soviet Union and of the whole drama of the Gulag and so on. But then, of course, there was, for me, the third choice, and that was the African National Congress, which, although it's a black movement, but it was never closed to whites. Never. Before, when it was illegal, one could work with them, which I did, and then when it became legal, when it became a political party and not a revolutionary organization, and one could be a card-carrying one, I was very happy to be able to make that change. And I'm still a member of the African National Congress, yes. And indeed, I had the enormous honor when Nelson Mandela got the Peace Prize. I was in his personal entourage when he went to Oslo to get it. I take it, to me, loyalty to your political party, mine is a leftist party, is that you also have the duty to criticize it when it does something that you disagree with. And that is how I regard my membership of the African National Congress. And I must say, in some of my books, there have been characters who are ANC members who are not very sympathetic, are not very good characters. I have never had that from my party. They have never chastised me, have given me the freedom to write what I must write. So, viva ANC!
Viva! Nadine, eu queria agradecer muito a sua presença aqui no Roda Viva. Esse Roda Viva especial vai chegando ao fim. Tivemos aqui a ativista política e escritora sul-africana Nadine Gordimer. Eu também agradeço a presença da nossa bancada de entrevistadores. Quero agradecer também a sua atenção, lembrando que a série especial Roda Viva Flip 2007 estará de volta amanhã, 00:30, com uma dupla de jornalistas e escritores. O inglês Robert Fisk e o americano Lawrence Wright. Dois veteranos repórteres que levaram para a literatura suas experiências na cobertura de guerras e consequências de conflito. Até lá!